I'm Emma, 28, and I thought sibling rivalry was something you outgrew after high school. That was before my brother Marcus decided to humiliate me at his housewarming party in front of 50 guests, sneering, "Not everyone can afford a two-bedroom apartment like me, right Emma?" Some of us are still living paycheck to paycheck in studio apartments. The laughter that followed felt like a knife to my chest, especially since I'd just worked a double shift at my second job to afford the expensive housewarming gift sitting on his kitchen counter. What Marcus didn't know was that his cruel joke would be the catalyst that exposed the massive fraud he'd built his perfect life on, and that within 6 months, he'd be begging me for the very financial help he'd just mocked me for not having. Before I tell you how I accidentally destroyed his entire world while trying to help him, I need to know, what do you think someone should do when family humiliates them publicly? Fight back immediately? Stay silent and plan revenge? Or just cut them off completely? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe because this story of sibling karma is about to get absolutely insane. Trust me, you won't believe what I discovered about my successful brother's real financial situation. To understand how Marcus's housewarming humiliation cut so deep, you need to understand the dynamic that had defined our relationship for 28 years. Marcus was the golden child, 3 years older, naturally charismatic, and seemingly blessed with the Midas touch when it came to success. While I struggled through college working multiple jobs to pay tuition, Marcus sailed through on academic scholarships and graduated summa cum laude with a business degree from our state's most prestigious university. Our parents, Janet and Robert Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but determination and a dream of giving their children better opportunities. They'd worked brutal hours, Dad as a factory supervisor, Mom cleaning office buildings at night, to build a stable middle-class life for us. But somehow, all their pride and attention seemed to flow toward Marcus, their shining example of the American dream realized. Marcus had landed a job at a prestigious consulting firm straight out of college, while I'd bounced between entry-level positions in marketing and communications, never quite finding my footing in the competitive job market. When Marcus bought his first car at 23, a sleek BMW, our parents threw a celebration dinner. When I finally saved enough to buy a reliable used Honda at 26, I got a polite "that's nice, honey" from Mom and a lecture from Dad about the importance of building good credit. The disparities became more pronounced as we entered our late 20s. Marcus seemed to effortlessly climb the corporate ladder, moving from analyst to senior consultant to project manager with impressive salary increases each step of the way. Meanwhile, I was still working 2 jobs, a marketing coordinator position during the day and freelance graphic design work in the evenings, just to make ends meet in our expensive city. But what really stung wasn't just the financial gap between us. It was how Marcus wielded his success as a weapon to diminish my achievements. When I finally got promoted to marketing manager after 3 years of grinding at my day job, Marcus's response was, "Oh, that's cute." I remember when I thought middle management was impressive too. When I proudly showed off a logo design that had won a local business award, he said, "It's nice that you have hobbies, Em. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real corporate responsibility." Our parents, caught up in their pride over Marcus's success, often inadvertently reinforced his superiority complex. Family dinners became showcases for Marcus's latest professional triumph, while my contributions to conversations were met with polite but distracted attention. When Marcus announced he was looking at buying a condo, Dad immediately offered to help with the down payment research and credit analysis. When I mentioned I was considering moving to a 1-bedroom apartment to get out of my cramped studio, Mom suggested I might want to focus on increasing my income first instead of upgrading my lifestyle prematurely. The worst part was how Marcus had started bringing his girlfriend, Sophia, to family gatherings. Sophia was everything I wasn't: polished, confident, working in finance, and perfectly complementary to Marcus's image of success. She would sweetly ask about my little design projects while discussing her own work managing investment portfolios worth millions. The condescension was wrapped in such perfect politeness that calling it out would have made me look petty and jealous. Marcus's social media presence was a constant reminder of our different trajectories. His Instagram was a carefully curated collection of expensive dinners, weekend trips to wine country, designer clothes, and professional accomplishments. He'd post photos from company retreats at luxury resorts, client dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and weekend getaways that cost more than I made in a month. Each post felt like a subtle dig at my own modest lifestyle, even though he never explicitly made comparisons online. The psychological impact of constantly being compared to Marcus's success was devastating to my self-esteem. I started second-guessing every career decision, every financial choice, every aspect of my life that didn't measure up to his apparent achievements. I developed anxiety about family gatherings, knowing that conversations would inevitably turn to Marcus's latest promotion or acquisition while my own accomplishments were treated as minor footnotes. What made it even more painful was that I genuinely loved my brother, despite his condescending attitude. We'd been close as children, and I remembered the Marcus who used to protect me from schoolyard bullies and help me with my homework. But success had changed him, turning him into someone who seemed to view my struggles as evidence of personal failure rather than the natural challenges of building a career in a difficult economy. The financial stress of trying to keep up with Marcus's lifestyle, even peripherally, was crushing me. I found myself spending money I didn't have on clothes for family events, expensive gifts for his various celebrations, and dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford just to avoid the embarrassment of suggesting somewhere cheaper. I was living paycheck to paycheck not just because of the cost of living, but because I was trying to maintain an image that wouldn't embarrass the family's golden boy. By the time Marcus announced he was buying a 2-bedroom condo in the city's most desirable neighborhood, I was emotionally and financially exhausted from years of being treated as the family's underachiever. His housewarming party invitation felt like another opportunity for him to showcase his success while highlighting my comparative failure. But I went anyway, because that's what family does even when family uses every opportunity to remind you that you're not measuring up to their standards. I should have known that Marcus wouldn't be content with simply hosting a successful party. He needed to make sure everyone understood exactly how much more successful he was than his struggling little sister. What I didn't realize was that his need to humiliate me would be the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose the house of cards his entire perfect life was built on. Marcus's housewarming party was everything I'd expected it to be, a perfectly orchestrated display of success designed to impress everyone in attendance. The 2-bedroom condo was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, modern furnishings that probably cost more than my annual rent, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a luxury magazine. Sophia moved through the space like a gracious hostess, pointing out the imported Italian marble countertops and the custom-built wine refrigerator that Marcus had installed. The guest list was a who's who of Marcus's professional and social circle. Colleagues from his consulting firm, clients he'd successfully worked with, college friends who'd also climbed the corporate ladder, and a sprinkling of family friends who could witness his triumph. I felt completely out of place in my department store dress and Target shoes, clutching the expensive espresso machine I'd bought as a housewarming gift despite knowing it would strain my budget for the next 2 months. The humiliation came during Marcus's toast to the assembled guests. He'd positioned himself in the center of the living room, raising a glass of what I'm sure was expensive champagne, and began a speech about hard work, determination, and the rewards of making smart financial decisions. That's when his eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the predatory gleam that I'd learned to dread over the years. "I want to thank all of you for celebrating this milestone with Sophia and me," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "This condo represents everything we've worked toward, the result of disciplined saving, strategic career moves, and understanding that success requires sacrifice." The crowd murmured appreciative agreement, and I felt my stomach start to clench with anticipation of what was coming next. Of course, Marcus continued with a slight smile, "Not everyone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment like this. Some of us are still living paycheck to paycheck in studio apartments, working multiple jobs just to make rent." His gaze locked onto mine as he delivered the killing blow. "Right, Emma? I mean, we all have different definitions of success, don't we?" The laughter that rippled through the room was devastating. Some guests glanced at me with sympathetic pity, others with barely concealed amusement at my expense. I felt my face burn with embarrassment as Marcus basked in the attention, clearly pleased with his clever way of highlighting the gulf between our financial situations while maintaining plausible deniability about the cruelty of his words. Sophia, standing beside him, didn't defend me or try to change the subject. Instead, she smiled indulgently at her boyfriend's joke, as if my financial struggles were indeed amusing rather than the result of working in an economy where wages hadn't kept pace with the cost of living. The betrayal I felt from her silent complicity was almost as painful as Marcus's public humiliation. I mumbled something about needing fresh air and escaped to the balcony, where I spent the next 20 minutes trying to compose myself while the party continued inside. Through the glass doors, I could see Marcus holding court, probably sharing more stories about his professional triumphs while guests admired his expensive furnishings and panoramic city views. But as I stood there on that balcony, something interesting happened. My initial hurt and embarrassment began to transform into something sharper and more analytical. Maybe it was my background in marketing, or maybe it was just the natural skepticism that comes from struggling financially, but I started really looking at Marcus's lifestyle with a critical eye for the first time. The numbers didn't quite add up. Even with his consulting salary, which I knew was good but not extraordinary, the math on his lifestyle seemed questionable. The luxury condo in the most expensive neighborhood in the city, the BMW payments, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners, the weekend trips, it was a lot of monthly overhead for someone just 5 years into their career, even a successful one. I thought about his social media posts over the past year, all those expensive experiences and purchases. I thought about how quickly he'd been able to save for a down payment on a condo that probably cost close to $1 million. I thought about how he never seemed stressed about money despite living in one of the most expensive cities in the country. When I rejoined the party, I started paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Marcus was using multiple credit cards throughout the evening, one for the catering, another for the wine, a third for the flowers. When someone complimented his watch, he casually mentioned that it was a business investment that he'd write off. When Sophia talked about their upcoming trip to Europe, she mentioned they'd gotten an amazing deal through Marcus's work connections. The more I observed, the more questions arose. How was a 28-year-old consultant affording this lifestyle? Was his salary really high enough to support all this, or was there something else going on? Had our parents helped him more than they'd let on? Was Sophia contributing more financially than she appeared to be? Or was Marcus living beyond his means in a way that would eventually catch up with him? These questions might have remained idle curiosity if not for what happened as I was leaving the party. I'd gone to the guest bathroom to freshen up before heading home, and I accidentally grabbed the wrong phone from the kitchen counter where everyone had been charging their devices. It wasn't until I was in my car that I realized I had Marcus's phone instead of my own. I should have just turned around and returned it immediately. That would have been the right thing to do. But I was still stinging from his public humiliation, still feeling the weight of years of condescension and comparison, and when his phone buzzed with a text message, I couldn't help but glance at the screen. The message was from someone named Tony, and the preview text that appeared on the lock screen made my blood run cold. Payment is 3 days late. You know what happens next if we don't get the money by Friday. That's when I realized that Marcus's perfect life might not be as perfect as it appeared, and that his cruel joke about my financial situation might have been projection of his own financial fears. What I discovered next would turn my understanding of everything upside down and give me the power to destroy him if I chose to use it. Sitting in my car outside Marcus's building, staring at his phone with that threatening message glowing on the screen, I felt my hands start to shake. The text from Tony wasn't the kind of message you get from a credit card company or a bank. This was something else entirely, something that suggested Marcus was involved with people who didn't send polite overdue notices or charge late fees. These were people who made threats. My conscience battled with my curiosity as the phone continued to buzz with incoming messages. Part of me knew I should immediately return the phone and pretend I'd never seen anything. But the other part of me, the part that was still humiliated and angry from his public mockery, needed to understand what was really going on behind the facade of Marcus's perfect life. When the phone buzzed again with another message from Tony, something in me snapped. I used Marcus's birthday to unlock the phone, pathetically predictable. And what I found in his messages made my stomach drop to my shoes. The conversation with Tony went back months, and it painted a picture of my brother that was completely different from the successful consultant he pretended to be. Tony wasn't just a creditor, he was a loan shark. And Marcus wasn't just behind on a payment, he was drowning in debt to dangerous people. The messages revealed that Marcus had initially borrowed $50,000 from Tony 18 months ago, claiming he needed it for a short-term investment opportunity that would pay out in 6 months. But instead of investing the money, Marcus had used it to fund his lifestyle, the down payment on the condo, the expensive furniture, the designer clothes, all of it. The loan had come with devastating terms that Marcus had either not understood or chosen to ignore. The interest rate was 20% monthly, not annually. What started as a $50,000 debt had ballooned to over $180,000 in 18 months, and Marcus had been making minimum payments that barely covered the interest while the principal continued to grow exponentially. But the loan shark debt was just the tip of the iceberg. As I scrolled through Marcus's financial apps, I discovered a web of credit card debt, personal loans, and financial obligations that painted a picture of someone living a completely unsustainable lifestyle. He had maxed out 17 different credit cards, taken out personal loans from multiple banks using inflated income statements, and had even borrowed against his 401k to make payments on other debts. The most shocking discovery was in his email, where I found correspondence with a company that specialized in creating fake pay stubs and employment verification documents. Marcus had been using these fabricated documents to qualify for loans and credit cards by claiming he made nearly 3 times his actual salary. He'd created an entire fictional financial profile to support his lifestyle, and it was all built on a foundation of lies that was about to collapse. His text messages with Sophia revealed another layer of deception. She had no idea about the extent of his financial problems. When she suggested expensive restaurants or weekend trips, Marcus would enthusiastically agree while secretly using credit cards or cash advances to pay for everything. He'd been lying to her just as much as he'd been lying to everyone else, maintaining the illusion of financial success while secretly spiraling toward bankruptcy. But the most heartbreaking discovery was in his messages with our parents. Marcus had been borrowing money from them regularly, always with elaborate stories about temporary cash flow issues or investment opportunities that required quick action. I found Venmo transactions showing that our parents, who had worked so hard to build their modest savings, had loaned Marcus over $40,000 in the past year alone. Money they would never see again, money that represented their retirement security and financial stability. The stress of maintaining these lies was clearly taking a toll on Marcus. His search history revealed late-night researches into bankruptcy attorneys, debt consolidation companies, and even more predatory lenders who promised to help people with bad credit and urgent financial needs. He'd been looking into payday loans, title loans, and other forms of high-interest lending that would only make his situation worse. I found evidence that he'd already started selling off his possessions to make payments. The expensive watch he'd been wearing at the party. He'd sold the original and replaced it with a convincing replica. The BMW? He was 3 payments behind and had been dodging calls from the finance company. Even some of the furniture in his showcase condo had been bought on store credit with balloon payments that were coming due soon. The most damning evidence was a spreadsheet he'd created titled Financial Reality, where he'd attempted to map out his true financial situation. His total debt was approaching $400,000, while his actual annual income was only $85,000. His minimum monthly payments exceeded his take-home pay by almost $3,000, which meant that every month he was falling further behind despite his desperate efforts to stay afloat. But Tony's messages weren't just about money, they were about consequences. The loan shark was done being patient, and his recent texts made it clear that Marcus had 1 week to come up with $25,000 or face serious consequences for his family. The implications of that threat made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. Tony was threatening to involve our parents, to hurt the people I loved most in the world. As I sat in my car reading through the devastating truth about my brother's life, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that the golden boy who'd just humiliated me was actually a fraud living a lie. But there was also fear, both for Marcus and for our family, who had no idea they were connected to someone who owed money to dangerous people. The irony was overwhelming. Marcus had just publicly mocked me for living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment, while he was secretly hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and facing threats from loan sharks. His cruel joke about my financial situation had been pure projection. He was the one who couldn't afford his lifestyle, not me. But I also realized that I now held information that could destroy Marcus completely. One phone call to our parents, one conversation with Sophia, one tip to his employer about his fraudulent loan applications, and his entire carefully constructed life would come crashing down. The question was, what was I going to do with this power? As Tony's messages continued to buzz with increasingly urgent threats, I realized that time was running out for Marcus whether I acted or not. His house of cards was about to collapse, and the only question was whether I would be the one to push it over, or whether I would try to help him find a way out of the mess he'd created. Either way, the brother who had just humiliated me was about to learn that karma has a way of making cruel jokes come back to haunt you. The drive home from Marcus's housewarming party felt surreal as his phone continued buzzing with increasingly threatening messages from Tony. I pulled over in a 24-hour diner parking lot to fully process what I'd discovered, and the deeper I dug into Marcus's digital life, the more horrifying the situation became. This wasn't just financial irresponsibility, this was a complex web of fraud and deception that could land him in federal prison. The loan shark debt was actually the least of his problems. As I scrolled through his email history, I found evidence that Marcus had been running an elaborate financial con game for over 2 years. He'd created fake business entities to apply for small business loans, using fabricated revenue projections and forged bank statements. He'd opened credit cards using slight variations of his name and different addresses to avoid detection by credit monitoring systems. Most damaging of all, he'd been embezzling money from his consulting firm by creating fake vendor accounts and approving payments to companies that existed only on paper. The embezzlement scheme was sophisticated and had been running for 18 months. Marcus would create invoices for fake consulting services, submit them through the company's accounts payable system, and have the payments deposited into bank accounts he controlled. He'd stolen over $120,000 from his employer, covering his tracks by spacing out the fake invoices and making them small enough to avoid triggering audit flags. But the recent increase in his debt payments had made him greedy. His latest fake invoices were larger and more frequent, creating a pattern that any competent auditor would spot immediately. His browser history revealed that someone at his firm was already asking questions. He'd been researching employee theft investigation procedures and statute of limitations for embezzlement with the desperate intensity of someone who knew his time was running out. There were forum posts on legal advice websites where someone with his writing style was asking hypothetical questions about plea bargains and minimum sentences for white-collar crimes. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was how he'd been manipulating our family to fund his lifestyle. The $40,000 our parents had loaned him was just the beginning. I found evidence that he'd been systematically exploiting their trust and love to extract money for his increasingly desperate situation. He'd told Dad that he was investing in real estate and needed short-term capital for down payments. He'd convinced Mom that he was starting a side business and needed inventory funding. Every story was carefully crafted to appeal to their immigrant work ethic and dreams of financial success. Marcus had even forged documents to support his lies to our parents. When Dad asked to see the real estate investment paperwork, Marcus created fake purchase agreements and property appraisals. When Mom wanted to understand his business plan, he produced fabricated market research and financial projections. Our parents, who trusted their successful son implicitly, never thought to verify the documents he showed them. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial fraud. Marcus would time his requests for family emergencies or emotional moments when our parents would be most likely to help without asking too many questions. He'd borrowed $15,000 during Dad's brief hospitalization last year, claiming he needed it to hire a specialist consultant for a work project that would result in a big promotion. He'd gotten another $10,000 from Mom by claiming he wanted to surprise Sophia with an engagement ring and asking her to keep the loan secret. Reading through these messages, I realized that Marcus wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing our parents' retirement security and peace of mind. Every dollar they gave him was a dollar they wouldn't have for their own emergencies or later life care. They were in their early 60s, approaching the age where they should be protecting their assets, not depleting them to fund their son's fraudulent lifestyle. The threats from Tony were escalating rapidly. His latest message wasn't just about money. It included photos of our parents' house, their car, and even images that appeared to be taken from inside Dad's workplace. "Your family has nice things," Tony had written. "Would hate to see anything happen to them because you can't pay your debts." This wasn't just financial intimidation anymore, this was a direct threat to our family's safety. But Tony wasn't the only creditor who was running out of patience. Marcus's credit card companies were beginning to coordinate their collection efforts, and several had already initiated legal proceedings. His bank had frozen one of his accounts due to suspected fraudulent activity. The BMW dealership had started repossession proceedings. His landlord had received court papers regarding the embezzlement investigation, which meant his housing situation was about to become precarious as well. The timeline for total collapse was accelerating. Based on the various notices and threatening communications in his phone, Marcus had less than 2 weeks before multiple creditors would begin aggressive collection actions. The loan shark wanted his money in 1 week. His employer's audit department had scheduled a meeting with him for the following Monday, a meeting that would almost certainly expose his embezzlement scheme. His credit card companies were preparing to file a coordinated lawsuit that would trigger an immediate investigation into his fraudulent loan applications. As I sat in that diner parking lot, scrolling through the wreckage of my brother's secret life, I felt a mixture of emotions I'd never experienced before. There was undeniable satisfaction in discovering that the golden boy who'd just humiliated me was actually a desperate criminal living on borrowed time. But there was also genuine fear for our family's safety and heartbreak over what this would do to our parents when the truth inevitably came out. The cruel irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Marcus had just publicly mocked me for living paycheck to paycheck, while he was actually living crime to crime, desperately trying to stay one step ahead of creditors, investigators, and dangerous people who had no patience for excuses. His joke about my studio apartment was particularly galling considering he was about to lose his expensive condo and possibly his freedom. But I also realized that I was now in possession of information that made me complicit in his crimes if I didn't act. Knowing about the embezzlement and not reporting it could make me an accessory after the fact. Knowing about the threats to our family and not warning them could put them in genuine danger. The phone in my hands contained evidence of felony crimes, and every minute I held onto it without taking action was a minute I was helping Marcus cover up his fraud. The question was no longer what I wanted to do about Marcus's humiliation of me. The question was what I was morally and legally obligated to do about the crimes I'd discovered. And with Tony's deadline looming and our parents in potential danger, I was running out of time to decide whether to save my brother or save my family from the disaster he'd created. What I decided to do next would change all our lives forever, but it would also expose just how perfectly karma can work when someone's cruelty becomes the catalyst for their own destruction. I spent 3 sleepless hours in that diner parking lot, Marcus's phone burning in my hands like evidence of crimes I was now forced to confront. Every new message that arrived made the situation more urgent and more terrifying. Tony had sent photos of our parents' daily routines, Dad leaving for work, Mom grocery shopping, their evening walks around the neighborhood. This wasn't idle intimidation, this was surveillance by someone preparing to make good on his threats. The weight of the decision was crushing. If I exposed Marcus immediately, I could protect our parents from physical danger and potentially limit their financial losses. But I would also be destroying my brother's life and sending him to prison for crimes that carried serious federal sentences. If I warned Marcus and gave him a chance to fix the situation, I'd be complicit in his fraud and potentially allowing him to dig himself deeper into debt and danger. By dawn, I'd made my choice. I drove to Marcus's condo and used his keys, which I'd found in his jacket pocket, to let myself in. He was passed out on his expensive couch, still wearing his clothes from the party, surrounded by empty bottles that suggested he'd spent the night drinking away the stress of maintaining his impossible lifestyle. When I shook him awake and handed him his phone, the look of confusion and then terror that crossed his face told me he knew exactly what I'd discovered. "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "About Tony. About the embezzlement. About the fake loan applications. About everything." Marcus's reaction was predictable: denial, then anger, then desperate attempts at explanation and justification. He claimed the embezzlement was just borrowing that he planned to pay back with interest. He insisted the loan shark debt was a temporary cash flow issue that he could resolve with his next promotion. He swore that our parents' money was safe investments that would pay them back double within a year. But when I showed him Tony's latest messages, the photos of our parents, the explicit threats, the countdown to violence, something in Marcus finally broke. The carefully maintained facade of control crumbled, and I saw my brother for what he'd become: a desperate, terrified man who'd lost control of a situation that was spiraling toward disaster for everyone he claimed to love. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, his hands shaking as he scrolled through Tony's increasingly menacing messages. "It was supposed to be short-term, just until I could get ahead. But the interest rates, the payments, the pressure to keep up appearances. I couldn't stop it. I kept thinking I could fix it with the next loan, the next promotion, the next score." The next hour was the most honest conversation my brother and I had ever had. Marcus laid out the full scope of his financial destruction with devastating clarity. The total debt was actually closer to $500,000 when you included the compound interest on the loan shark money, the credit card balances, the embezzled funds he'd have to repay, and the various personal loans he'd obtained through fraud. His take-home pay couldn't cover even the minimum payments on legitimate debts, let alone satisfy loan sharks who demanded their money with violence-backed urgency. But what broke my heart was learning why Marcus had started down this path. The pressure to be the perfect son, the golden child who justified our parents' sacrifices and validated their American dream, had been crushing him for years. He'd been promoted beyond his actual abilities at work and was terrified that admitting he was struggling would expose him as a fraud. When he couldn't afford the lifestyle that his position seemed to require, he'd started borrowing to maintain appearances. Each lie had required bigger lies to support it, until he'd built a house of cards so precarious that any disturbance would bring it all crashing down. "I couldn't be the failure," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't be the son who wasted their sacrifices, who proved that all their work was for nothing." Every time I thought about telling the truth, I imagined the disappointment in their eyes, the shame of admitting that their perfect son was actually a complete screw-up. The irony was devastating. In his desperate attempt to avoid disappointing our parents, Marcus had created a situation that would destroy them financially and emotionally. The son who'd been trying to protect their pride was about to become the source of their greatest shame and financial ruin. But Tony's deadline wasn't waiting for family therapy sessions. We had 4 days to come up with $25,000 or face consequences that would extend far beyond Marcus's personal destruction. The loan shark had made it clear that he viewed our entire family as collateral for Marcus's debt, and his surveillance photos proved he was serious about escalating to violence. Marcus had no assets left to liquidate. His condo was mortgaged beyond its value, his car was about to be repossessed, and his credit was so destroyed that no legitimate lender would even consider his applications. His employer's audit meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, which meant his embezzlement would be exposed regardless of what we did about Tony. The federal investigation that would follow would freeze any remaining assets and make it impossible for him to access funds even if he had them. That's when I realized that I was the only person in our family with the financial resources to potentially save us from immediate physical danger. My careful budgeting, my modest lifestyle, my refusal to live beyond my means, all the things Marcus had just mocked me for at his party, had left me with clean credit, a healthy savings account, and the ability to access emergency funds. The decision I faced was agonizing. I could use my life savings, money I'd carefully accumulated over years of living paycheck to paycheck, money I'd planned to use for graduate school or a house down payment to pay off the loan shark and protect our family from violence. But doing so would reward Marcus's fraud and enable his destructive behavior while depleting my own financial security. Alternatively, I could refuse to help and let the situation play out naturally. Tony would likely escalate to violence, our parents would be devastated to learn about Marcus's crimes, and our family would be destroyed by the consequences of his choices. But at least I wouldn't be financially ruining myself to clean up his mess. As I sat in Marcus's living room, watching my brother cry over the destruction he'd brought on our family, I realized that this moment would define not just our relationship, but my own character. The brother who'd just humiliated me for my modest lifestyle was now depending on that same modest lifestyle to save him from the consequences of his grandiose lies. The choice I made next would determine whether our family survived this crisis intact, and whether Marcus would face the full consequences of his fraud or get one last chance to somehow make things right. But either way, the golden boy's perfect life was over, and the sister he'd mocked was now the only thing standing between him and complete destruction. Sitting across from my broken brother in his soon-to-be foreclosed luxury condo, I made a decision that would haunt me for months but ultimately save our family from destruction. I would pay Tony the $25,000 to protect our parents from violence, but Marcus would have to confess everything to them and face the legal consequences of his crimes. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation, and no more using our family's love to fund his fraudulent lifestyle. The negotiation with Tony was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Marcus arranged a meeting in a public place, a busy coffee shop downtown, where I handed over a cashier's check representing nearly all of my life savings. Tony was exactly what you'd expect from a loan shark, intimidating, calculating, and completely devoid of sympathy for the family he'd been threatening. He made it clear that this payment only bought us safety temporarily. Marcus still owed him over $150,000, and that debt wasn't forgiven just because we'd covered his immediate threat. But Tony also recognized that Marcus had no ability to pay the remaining debt, and he was pragmatic enough to understand that you can't squeeze blood from a stone. After some tense negotiation, he agreed to settle the entire debt for $50,000, with the understanding that if Marcus ever borrowed money from dangerous people again, the consequences would be swift and permanent. The remaining $25,000 would come from liquidating everything Marcus owned and working out a payment plan that would take years to complete. The conversation with our parents was the hardest thing our family had ever endured. Marcus, to his credit, confessed everything: the embezzlement, the loan shark debt, the fraudulent loan applications, the manipulation of their trust and love. He laid out the full scope of his crimes and financial destruction with brutal honesty, not attempting to minimize his responsibility or shift blame to external circumstances. Our parents' reaction was everything Marcus had feared and more. Dad was devastated that his successful son was actually a criminal who'd been stealing from his employer and lying to his family for years. Mom was heartbroken that the money they'd loaned him, money that represented their financial security and retirement dreams, was gone forever, spent on maintaining a lifestyle built on lies and deception. But what surprised me was how quickly their devastation transformed into protective parental instinct. Once they understood that Marcus was facing federal embezzlement charges and potential prison time, their focus shifted from disappointment to damage control. Dad immediately began researching criminal defense attorneys, while Mom started calculating how much of their remaining savings they could access to help with legal fees. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now being praised for the very financial prudence that Marcus had mocked just days earlier. "Emma," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion, "if you hadn't been so careful with your money, if you hadn't lived within your means all these years, we wouldn't have been able to protect our family from those dangerous people." The reversal of fortune was complete. The daughter who'd been seen as the underachiever was now the family's financial savior. Marcus's employer moved quickly once the audit uncovered his embezzlement scheme. He was terminated immediately and escorted from the building by security, his company laptop and access credentials revoked before he could destroy any additional evidence. The firm's attorneys made it clear that they would be pressing criminal charges and pursuing civil remediation for the full amount of his theft, plus interest and legal fees. Sophia's reaction to learning about Marcus's double life was swift and brutal. She moved out of the condo within 48 hours of his confession, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind the engagement ring Marcus had bought with borrowed money. Her final text to him was devastatingly simple: "I don't know who you really are, but I can't be with someone who's built our entire relationship on lies." The perfect couple's perfect life dissolved as quickly as it had been constructed. The legal proceedings moved with frightening speed. Federal prosecutors were interested in Marcus's case because his embezzlement scheme crossed state lines and involved mail fraud in his fake vendor invoicing system. His defense attorney, paid for with the last of our parents' retirement savings, negotiated a plea agreement that would spare him a lengthy trial in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. The plea deal required Marcus to serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He would have to pay full restitution to his former employer, $127,000 plus interest and legal fees, and submit to financial monitoring for the duration of his probation. Any assets he acquired during that time would be subject to garnishment until the debt was satisfied. But prison was almost a relief compared to the social consequences of his exposure. The story of the successful consultant who'd embezzled from his company to fund a fraudulent lifestyle spread quickly through our city's professional circles. His former colleagues distanced themselves from him, his social media accounts were flooded with condemnation from people who'd attended his housewarming party, and his name became synonymous with white-collar crime in our community. The housewarming party that had been the scene of my humiliation was now being discussed as the last hurrah of a con man who'd fooled everyone, including himself. Guests who'd been impressed by his expensive lifestyle were now embarrassed that they'd been taken in by someone living on stolen money. The 2-bedroom condo he'd mocked me for not being able to afford was sold at a loss to pay creditors, and Marcus moved back into our parents' basement, a fall from grace so complete it seemed almost biblical. The months leading up to Marcus's sentencing were a strange period of family healing and reconstruction. Without the pressure of maintaining his fraudulent lifestyle, Marcus became more honest and vulnerable than he'd been since childhood. He got a job at a local warehouse, earning minimum wage and turning over most of his paycheck to restitution payments. The work was humbling but legitimate, and for the first time in years, he was living within his actual means. Our relationship began to slowly rebuild during this period. Marcus wrote me a letter apologizing not just for his housewarming humiliation, but for years of condescension and dismissive treatment. He acknowledged that his mockery of my financial situation had been projection of his own fears and insecurities, and that my careful money management and honest work ethic were actually qualities he should have admired rather than ridiculed. "You were living the life I pretended to have," he wrote. "Financially responsible, honest about your circumstances, working hard to build something real instead of stealing to maintain something fake. When I mocked you at the party, I was really mocking myself for not having your courage to live authentically." The day Marcus reported to federal prison was surreal. Our family gathered to say goodbye to the son and brother who would spend the next 18 months learning that actions have consequences and that there's no amount of charm or intelligence that can indefinitely postpone the reckoning that comes from living a lie. As I watched him walk through the prison doors, wearing the orange jumpsuit that would be his uniform for the next year and a half, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The brother who'd humiliated me for living paycheck to paycheck was now literally living meal to meal in a federal institution. The golden boy who'd mocked my studio apartment was now sharing a cell with strangers. The successful consultant who'd suggested I couldn't afford a 2-bedroom apartment was now sleeping on a prison bunk with a serial number instead of an address. 18 months later, I was standing outside the federal correctional facility waiting for Marcus's release, reflecting on how completely our roles had reversed since that devastating housewarming party. While my brother had been serving his sentence, I'd been promoted twice at my marketing job, had saved enough to move into a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment, and had even started my own freelance design business on the side. The careful financial habits he'd once mocked had allowed me to not only survive our family crisis but actually thrive in its aftermath. Marcus emerged from prison a fundamentally changed person. The arrogant, condescending golden boy was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned humility the hardest way possible. Prison had stripped away all the pretenses and facades that had defined his identity for so long, forcing him to confront who he really was beneath the expensive clothes and luxury lifestyle he'd fraudulently maintained. The first thing he did was apologize, not just to me, but to our parents, to his former colleagues, to Sophia, and to everyone whose trust he'd betrayed during his years of deception. These weren't the shallow apologies of someone trying to rebuild their image, but the deep, painful acknowledgments of someone who'd finally understood the true cost of their actions. "Emma," he said as we drove away from the prison, "I need you to know that every day for the past 18 months, I've thought about that night at my housewarming party. About how cruel I was to you, about how I mocked you for having exactly the kind of integrity and financial responsibility that I completely lacked. You were everything I pretended to be, and I was too arrogant and insecure to see it." The conditions of Marcus's probation were strict and humbling. He had to live with our parents, submit to regular financial monitoring, and continue making restitution payments that would take years to complete. He found work at a non-profit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society, work that paid modestly but gave him purpose and helped him understand the impact of his choices on others. Watching Marcus adjust to life after prison was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The man who'd once driven a BMW and lived in a luxury condo now took the bus to work and lived in his childhood bedroom. The consultant who'd once enjoyed expensive dinners at exclusive restaurants now brown-bagged lunch and carefully budgeted every dollar. The social climber who'd once hosted elaborate parties now spent quiet evenings helping our parents with household tasks and slowly rebuilding their trust. But the most profound change was in how our family dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the underachieving daughter who couldn't measure up to her successful brother's standards. Instead, I was the responsible child who'd saved our family from financial and physical destruction, who'd made the hard choices when Marcus couldn't, and who'd proven that steady, honest work was worth more than fraudulent displays of wealth. Our parents' perspective had changed as well. They now spoke proudly of my career achievements, my financial responsibility, and my integrity during the crisis. When friends asked about their children, they led with stories about my promotion and my growing design business, while Marcus's prison sentence was mentioned only as a learning experience that had helped him find his true values. The community's perception had also undergone a complete reversal. People who'd once viewed Marcus as the successful young professional now saw him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of living beyond your means and prioritizing image over integrity. Meanwhile, I'd gained respect for my loyalty to family, my financial wisdom, and my grace under pressure during the crisis. 6 months after his release, Marcus asked me to meet him for coffee at a modest cafe near his workplace. He wanted to show me something he'd been working on during his probation, a detailed financial plan for paying back our parents the money he'd borrowed from them over the years. It would take him nearly a decade, living modestly and dedicating every spare dollar to restitution, but he was determined to restore what he'd taken from their retirement security. "I know I can never fully repay what I've cost this family," he said, sliding the payment schedule across the table. "But I want you to know that every month for the next 10 years, I'm going to send Mom and Dad a check. It won't earn interest like a real investment would have, but it's the best I can do to honor the trust one violated." Looking at my brother across that cafe table, I saw someone who'd finally learned the lessons that our parents had tried to teach us as children, that honesty matters more than appearances, that real success comes from hard work rather than shortcuts, and that family loyalty means protecting the people you love rather than exploiting their trust for personal gain. The irony of our situation wasn't lost on either of us. The brother who'd once mocked me for living paycheck to paycheck was now doing exactly that, while I had achieved the financial stability and career success he'd once fraudulently claimed to possess. The 2-bedroom apartment he'd used to humiliate me was now a symbol of the honest prosperity I was building through legitimate means, while he was grateful for the modest room in our parents' house that represented his second chance at building a real life. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Marcus's transformation was how genuinely happy he seemed despite his reduced circumstances. The constant stress of maintaining lies, dodging creditors, and living in fear of exposure had been replaced by the peace that comes from living authentically. He might have been earning a fraction of his former fraudulent income, but he was sleeping soundly for the first time in years because he had nothing to hide. The final piece of justice came when Marcus completed his first year of probation successfully. His probation officer commended him for his compliance, his steady employment, and his commitment to restitution. But more importantly, our parents told him they were proud of the man he was becoming, not the fraudulent success he'd pretended to be, but the honest, humble person who was slowly rebuilding his life through legitimate means. As I reflect on this entire experience, I'm struck by how perfectly karma worked in our situation. Marcus's cruel joke about my financial situation had been the catalyst that led to the discovery of his own financial crimes. His attempt to humiliate me for living within my means had exposed how far outside his means he'd been living. And ultimately, the sister he'd mocked for being financially responsible had become the person whose financial responsibility saved the family he'd put in danger. The brother who'd once sneered, "Not everyone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment like me," had learned that he couldn't afford it either, and that there's no shame in living honestly within your actual means rather than fraudulently beyond them. So here's my question for all of you who followed this incredible journey of family betrayal and redemption: have you ever had someone mock you for qualities that actually turned out to be your greatest strengths? Sometimes the things people ridicule us for, being careful with money, living modestly, prioritizing stability over status, are exactly the qualities that save us when life gets difficult. Marcus's story proves that you can't build lasting happiness on a foundation of lies, and that sometimes the cruelest jokes come back to haunt the people who tell them. His housewarming humiliation of me had been the beginning of his own downfall, and my modest lifestyle had been the foundation of our family's salvation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life karma stories. Share this video with anyone who's ever been made to feel ashamed of living within their means or prioritizing financial responsibility over flashy displays of wealth. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with sibling rivalry, family financial drama, or moments when your careful choices paid off in unexpected ways. Thank you for joining me on this journey through family betrayal, financial fraud, and ultimate redemption. Remember, the qualities that make you different. Your caution, your honesty, your willingness to live authentically rather than impress others, might just be the qualities that save you when everything else falls apart. Sometimes the best revenge against people who mock your choices is simply proving that your choices were right all along.